be having some discussions today that are continuing on the vein of what we've talked about in the last couple shows, but even more specifically, because I did ask this question to Dr. Patino, who's in his office over there, as to what makes an actual mass shooter. What has led up to that decision to pick up a firearm and go take lives when I know statistically speaking, the vast majority of these things end up in the death of the shooter. So it's basically a very active suicide. And you sent me an article about that. There's been some psychologists and psychiatrists who've done some solid research, but it doesn't seem that any of our politicians and the like are listening. So could you go over that? Tell me what we're talking about here.
Yeah, and you and I talked a little bit about how we have moved away a little bit from the mental health realm and especially lately talking a lot about guns. And we want to bring it back a little bit into mental health. What does it mean? What are the myths? What are the realities of what we're dealing with? And when it comes to talking about how do one ends up doing a mass shooting, right? And number one is terribly important to understand that mass shootings are extremely rare,
Mm.
right? So a mass shooter, and I'm going to use the word himself because 99.9% of the time are men, uh, require a combination of a number of things, right? And it's not something that happens overnight, and it's something that happens usually slowly.
So this is really a lifetime development or at least over a certain amount of time. This is not a snap to quick decision like some other forms of suicide can be. This is more, is it more premeditated, or is it just simply the pressure cooker builds up so much that they explode in a larger fashion?
What is evolutionary?
Okay.
So one of the main features of most of the people who end up doing things like this, mass shootings, is trauma, right? So there's been some degree of trauma early in their lives. Now, when we talk about trauma, there's a lot of different types of trauma, right? Let me give you an example. There's trauma that happens from you being exposed to utero with drugs or alcohol. That is a trauma to an individual who's not born yet, right? There's trauma that happens at the moment of birth. There's trauma that happens after you're born because of either abuse or neglect, right? So when we for us as psychiatrists, when we start looking at trauma, we are looking at different types of trauma. That is one. The other one is genetics, right? So for example, some people will state that sociopathy in certain people has genetic basis, right? A
Hmm.
different type of brain. So not all sociopaths are made. Some sociopaths are born, right? So you start putting the the different pieces together when you start evaluating, and looking for risk. So why am I using the word risk? Because in psychiatry, we're not good at making predictions, right? Actually, science in general is not good at making prediction. I mean, I can have 100 people in front of me, and if I'm a cardiologist and they tell me, looking at what you have in front of you, who's going to have a heart attack? We're not very good at that. But if we start digging into the history of the individual, we can get to the point of saying this individual is at risk. So we have to look a little closer to them, right?
Or in a group of people, this is the people at highest risk.
Exactly. So if you're in school, for example, and you are in a I don't know, first grade school class, and you're having a couple of kids that have this history of being aggressive, you know, that have this history of being not empathic to the suffering of others, that have this kind of enjoyment of the pain that are causing to other people, right? Then we have to investigate further, meaning the fact that they have those features doesn't mean they're going to be mass shooters, but we want to know if there are other features, like is the kid traumatized in any way? Did the kid have some neurodevelopmental issues? That the kid has learning issues? That the kid has issues in terms of relating to other kids since there's a history of it, right? Was the kid exposed to drugs in utero? We start putting all those pieces together so you can create the first scenes of the movie, right?
Mm.
But that movie is going to continue to build up. So, what happens if you are 6, 7 years old and you're aggressive and you're violent and you enjoy the suffering of others and you're poking at people all the time just for the fun of it? Well, there's going to be retaliation, right? So the retaliation is going to end up giving you a sense of this, I'm being rejected. How come I'm not being accepted, right? And then you parents have a lot of difficulty dealing with your intensity, so you get spanked a little too much, right? And dad is angry all the time with you. So the message the kid starts to get over time is, I'm not accepted, right? And then that continues, with that process of rejection, criticism, not acceptance, and you start developing resentments, right? If we add that you have certain issues socially or psychologically that you don't fit in groups, let's say when you become a teenager, then you're going to start experiencing more rejection and more resentment, right? And then you develop depression, you develop anxiety, you get into using some drugs, you become more and more isolated. And isolation nowadays is a lot easier because of technology,
Mm.
right? So it's a lot easier for kids to pretend to be part of something when in reality they're very isolated and not accepted, right? So they start moving toward areas in social media, for example, where they find some degree of acceptance, right? And then they become more and more resentful. And you say something at the beginning that I think is terribly important. And very often we don't look at mass shootings from that perspective. And is that a mass shooter is a suicidal person.
Mm.
When the person decides to kill other people, it's also decided that he is going to get killed, right? So that does happen. So the process requires that we really get embedded into identifying who's likely to become a risk and who is a risk now. And there are tools for that. And then we talked about the other day in the program about uh, the Secret Service working together with the Department of Education and developing certain tools that are used in schools. The problem is that um, the process becomes more important than the individual. And we see
Mm.
this everywhere. We see this in hospitals, we see this in schools, we see this problem in many places where putting the marks in the paper become the important thing versus what is the data that we're trying to collect, right? I mean, does the data really tells us, and we start missing a lot of things. So kids that should be at risk are not identified because everybody's more concerned about completing the form than really personalizing the form, right?
And you said something. I wanted to talk more about the personalization and counseling, but you said something about resentment. Is the resentment that builds up what then manifests into them targeting a specific group or people or individuals in order to blame? I mean, there seems to be a blame factor in a lot of the violence, not necessarily mass shootings, but you see a lot of the violence out there, and or even the recent mass shootings that are race um, oriented. There's always a desire to hurt the group or the people that they think have wronged them. Is that part of that psychology?
Well, when you are empty and lonely and rejected and criticized and you have no sense of value, right? You're extremely vulnerable to extremes, meaning you're vulnerable for recruitment into certain areas of society, right? And we've seen that for a very long time. You're looking for a place to belong with,
Mm.
right? So you start moving into the extremes, either racism or cults, where you can feel that you belong somewhere because you've never belonged anywhere. The problem is that usually extremes foster hate, right? So what you're buying in return from belonging is the hate in that group, right? So if you start looking at radical groups and how they do their recruiting, they're always looking for people on the fringes of acceptance, people that have self-esteem issues, kids that have a tremendous need to be accepted. And it's not only in mass shootings, okay? We see this in human trafficking, in prostitution. We see this in drug abuse. So I always like to say, when I'm writing something about this, um, that you cannot fix this problem when the kid has become terribly empty.
Mm.
You prevent the kid from getting empty, but
And
sometimes that's
and
very difficult.
that prevents the problem. But in order to do that, we have to be able to identify these people early in life. Is that correct?
Yeah, and you have to understand that half to two-thirds of the development of that kid is going to be experienced at home, right? So if the kid also grows up with an experience of hate, with an experience of not acceptance, with an experience of empty uniqueness, if you may, right? I mean, we are the best. Nobody is like us. And you have to reject anybody who's not like you. Then that also fosters this idea, which is kind of an empty narcissism. In reality, most narcissists are pretty empty too. But most of the kids that end up with the mass shootings are not necessarily narcissistic. They tend to be more avoidant, sociopathic, empty.
Mm. So you said that, I know in the article that we read, which I think is going to be published later this week, that really identifying these kids has to occur very young, first grade, second grade, and third grade, not high school and the like. But if someone isn't found or isn't seen as at risk for whatever reasons early in life, is there a way to save them when they get to high school and have been rejected all these times?
Well, again, the predictability is very difficult. The identification of risk is important, and that requires community work, right? It requires parental involvement, teachers' involvement, if the kid has a job involvement, right? So when you get to be 16, 17, we have to be paying attention, right? So if a kid is depressed and isolated and not participating and quit his job and is starting to move more toward drugs and is spending a lot of time alone, we want to know what that kid's doing. And the only way we can get to that is communicating with the child, right? Or with the adolescent. We have to establish a means of non critical communication. What do we do? What we do is say, you're a bad kid because you're hiding all the time. You know, you never come down to spend time with us, so you're a bad kid. You don't communicate. And we very seldom extend a hand and say, I've seen that you spend a lot of time in your room. I just want you to know that I'm here
Mm.
if you need anything. We have to open the door so they can have an option, right? And again, most of the kids who are in isolation are not going to be mass shooters. But we want to know and we have to pay attention to who they are with, what they're doing, how they're spending their time, and look at the social media. I mean, and I know for kids it's a little difficult, but I think it's important that we are part of the social media environment. You
Mm.
know, can I be your friend in Facebook, right? Type of a thing. We want to know what they're writing. We want to know if they have any contact socially with any friends. We want to know who they are. We want to establish a relationship with them. So, the nature of adolescence in particular is to reject. The nature of adolescence is separation. The essence of adolescence is to grow into your own self. But how do you grow into your own self if you don't have any sense of security?
Mm.
Right? You feel empty, you feel lonely, you feel rejected. So kids are not going to say, it's all my parents' fault. Basically, the kids are going to say, I'm not worth anything. I mean, the
So
message I've got all my life is that I'm not worth anything.
So is this a cultural thing? I mean, I remember back, I mean, in the 80s and stuff, the whole thing about the gangs was that here are a bunch of these kids who don't have fathers, who don't have support, and they go to the gang again, get recruited because they're given support, they're given some power, and they do horrible things. But now this isn't a gang; these are individuals doing these things. Is it kind of the same dynamic?
It's a little different, you know, when it comes to gangs, it's an interesting phenomena because gangs are a subculture. They're not separate. They're not avoidant. They can be very sociopathic, but gangs used to have something that is criminal, but at the same time cohesive, meaning they had code, right? They had rules. They had way of communicating. They had people they would hurt and people they wouldn't hurt, right? They had some leans. They had kind of distorted values that allow them to stay together, right?
Hmm.
When you're alone, you don't have that opportunity. I mean, it's just you. Your gang is in social media, right? And they love you today and they hate you tomorrow. So there's no rules of engagement, if you may, in
Hmm.
terms of the social interactiveness. So that becomes very damaging. Now, it's really fascinating to see how gangs have kind of gotten out of fashion, right, to some degree. I never like to say our times were better because our times were different and they were better for us because we lived them. But this is what we have today, right? So there is something to be said about how damaging neglect is for our kids.
Hmm.
You know, we started by talking about trauma, right? The kids have some sort of trauma that makes them question themselves, whether it's biological, psychological, social, and then they grow up with certain deficits, and then they get a lot of rejection and criticism, and some of them may move into guns and violence and video games and all of that. On the other hand, we have to recognize that in order for us to do some preventing, we need to recognize that neglect is a lot more damaging to kids than abuse. And I'm not advocating abuse in any way. What I'm saying is neglect is so pervasive and is so hidden, you know, because basically you neglect by not doing.
I was gonna say, could you just define that for us? I mean, people understand abuse as verbal, physical, sexual, but neglect, just you know.
Let me give you a kind of a basic example of an interactive neglect between the father and the child, right? And this is a simple example that it may sound kind of silly. But let's say the kids go to school, right? And the kid gets a straight A and comes home and gives the report card to dad. And dad looks at it and throws it away. That's neglect. Because the message the kids is saying is it doesn't matter how successful I am, I cannot make this person be proud of me. And if you're a child, all you want is your parents to be proud of you. I mean, that is your job. From the time you're born, well, the time you're born to the time you're about 12, all you want is that recognition that somebody comes and says, you're worth it. You know, I'm here and I'm recognizing your value. But if you do that report card thing every time, you know, and dad doesn't have enough time to look at you and said, hey, how are you feeling today? Is there anything you want to talk about? You know, and sometimes we think that being over involved is not neglectful,
Hmm.
but you can be neglectful by shuffling your kids from place to place. And you say, well, I'm a great parent. You know, I take him to soccer and then I take him to basketball, then karate, and then music lessons. Okay. So you're shuffling your kids from one place to another. That is not love and recognition. That is something else, right? So neglect, in order to avoid neglect, we have to communicate. We have to hear more than talk. And when we as parents think that we know everything, okay, then we have nothing to learn from our kids.
Hmm.
And being a parent is a two-way street, right? Yes, I'm in charge. Yes, I set the rules. Yes, I set the discipline and the expectations. But then we have to recognize their assets and deficits and accommodate all of that to the needs of the child.
So a child that is neglected, whether it's an active neglect or just true neglect, they're never messed with. What does that do to them? What is the archetype person who's been neglected? How do they because when they go through adolescence and become a young adult? What do you see in those people?
Well, that's what I see every day in the hospital, right? Because in the hospital, I deal with suicidal kids, homicidal kids, kids who are depressed, kids who are anxious. But there's a common denominator with most of them, and is that in some way, shape, or form, they have sustained both abuse and neglect, right? And there's some kids, I mean, I saw two of them this morning, and I actually had to have conversation with them about this and saying, you know, you have very good survival skills, even though you don't trust anybody, right? And that anger that you have has kept you going. I mean, this is an angry kid who wants to kill people, right? But he hasn't killed anybody, and he has suicidal thoughts, but he hasn't tried to kill herself. So it's acted out in a lot of different ways, right? But I struggle to find what's positive about you. So I had to come back and say, well, you have good survival skills. Despite all the stuff that has happened to you, that when you were sexually abused, you were beat up when you were little, you were abandoned by your mom, you know, in school they kicked you out because you were fighting with everybody. So the only the message you have received all your life is you're not worth anything, right? But despite that, you're still here.
But how does that manifest in the behaviors? What is if you? I know a person who's I guess had that experience. What would they seem to be like to me? Or do they mask it? Is there something consistent that someone can see as a red flag or no?
No, well, you can. You know that the kids are going to be problematic, right? But you can problematically active or you can be problematically passive. The problematically active patient is the individual who's been neglected and abused so much they don't trust anybody. And if you make any move to get close to them physically or emotionally, they'll strike at you. So
Mm.
they'll hit you, right? But there are kids that become very, very withdrawn, isolated, depressed, and they're not communicating with you. So you can see the whole gamut of behaviors, and it's very individual to some degree, depending on the biological temperament of that child in the presence of other psychiatric disorders. For example, a kid that has attention deficit disorder is going to be different than a kid that has major depression or than a kid that has just uh, issues related to anxiety. So we have to be learning to separate those so we can individualize the help for that particular kid. But we have to recognize their assets because invariably all of these kids, they will tell you, nobody's ever told me that I had anything valuable.
Mm.
So think about getting that message all the time, all the time, all the time. And sometimes, in fairness to parents, there are kids that are not easy to soothe, right? That are not easy to understand, who are very hyperactive, they're very rowdy, they're aggressive, they fight with the other siblings, and they actually test your limits and your patience, right? So that's where you have to be very careful and always remind ourselves that whatever we do to try to recognize anybody who's at risk, whatever we do, we have to recognize that it's not about us. It's about the kid. Because we put so much investment and fantasy in the idea of being a good parent that we forget the purpose.
Wasn't their ego get involved too? Mike, it can't be my kid kind of thing. But something it's come to me as listening to you. It'd be very difficult for someone, unless they're a trained counselor, psychologist, psychiatrist, potentially to recognize those things. But it is an easy tool for everyone just to say, no matter what, if you're encountering a child, tell them something positive. You may not be able to identify that they have a problem, but by simply saying something positive, giving them some reinforcement, giving them some attention that's in a healthy, good way, could on its own really be preventative.
Absolutely. I mean, we all have had, excuse me, good teachers and bad teachers, right? But you're going to school. And if you remember, who were the good teachers? The ones who were listening. So something that we as adults need to learn to do is to talk less and listen more. Excuse me, but not just listen more, but listening properly, meaning what is the kid trying to tell me?
Mm,
I mean, I had to tell you this because in my group, there's four providers, including myself. Excuse me. And in my group, we have about 58 patients every day, right? In a hospital setting, right? So when I walk into the unit, I run a unit that approximately 19 girls, ages 11 to 17. And some of them like me, and sometimes some of them don't. But I always had to maintain the same attitude. And some of them are very aggressive. They will tell me how ugly I am, how fat I am, how dare you do this to me, blah 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 blah. Right? So I hear all of that. I don't have the luxury of getting angry
mm.
because it's not about me. I mean, they're basically practicing everything they do with the rest of the world, but keep the people away from them. So for me, I had to turn around and say, okay, I hear you, but about you, how do you want me to help you? What do you need? Because those attitudes and behaviors basically become a survival skill for them. I mean, you have to understand these are kids that are seriously traumatized, both physically, sexually, abandonment by parents. So it's hard for them to accept your help. It's hard for them that you extend a hand because they don't trust you.
So wouldn't that be one way to potentially identify some of these kids as they go through adulthood? It's the ones that are putting up those barriers to any type of connection with somebody. Would that be a way to really kind of start seeing that again later in life? Maybe if you haven't picked it up in the first, second, third grade, those
I
type of
think
behaviors.
yes, I think that somebody who you're having difficulty getting close to erases a red flag. By itself doesn't mean anything. But it raises a red flag that we have to dig a little deeper into that particular situation, right? Because it could be as simple as the kid has autistic behaviors, right? And
Mm.
it's a different neurodevelopmental issue. Or it could be that there's a lot of problems that we haven't identified and we need to try to help. Always with the idea that trying to help these kids is not to prevent mass shootings, is to help the kid be more adaptive, right? Because if the idea is we have to identify potential mass shooters and then what we're going to do with them, kick them out,
Yeah. Yeah.
right?
Point. Good point.
So it's about how do we, it's like bullying, right? We always talk about what do we do with the guy who's bullying other children. And we talked about this in a separate program. And the issue is, well, you try to help him.
Mhm.
You try to help him not do it, not because we want him to stop bullying other kids, because it's not good for them to be doing it. Right? Because we're starting to identify certain behaviors. So we need to start looking at the behaviors that can grow into a potential mass shooting, right?
So, what is the solution? We're talking about, putting security guards, arming the teachers, which personally is the most ludicrous thing I could possibly think of. All sorts of other stuff. When it really should be more on the grassroots level and counseling. So, if you could write the legislation and enforce it, what would it be? What would we do in our schools right now to do that?
You know, I'm going to sound a little negative, but I don't think that we can legislate this
Hmm.
because the change is not a legislative change. And unfortunately, legislative change is guided by political opportunity, is not guided by the well-being of children, right? So, and I know I may be criticized for saying that, but the reality is that this is a change that requires culture and intervention. Back to the basics. This is about the kids and how can we make the kids get what the kids need so they can be successful in life. Now, In that phrase, there's a lot of stuff that happens in between, right? But making schools afford is not a way of spending your money, right? Maybe we need to hire more psychologists, right? And start identifying people proactively, right? But we need the cooperation of the parents because it's a culture. You see, nowadays when you call a parent and say your kids may have a problem,
They get
the
angry.
attitude's automatically defensive, right? And we need to engage the parents in the process of understanding that the kids are not the school's responsibility. It's their responsibility, for good or bad, right? They go to school to be educated, but the basic values and guidance is provided at home.
Mm.
So it's not unusual that most of the kids that I see with very serious problems come from homes that were not providing the values necessary for them to develop some emotional cohesiveness and maturity so they can take risks, right? Properly. So all of these kids are taking risks that they shouldn't be taking that can hurt other people.
So unfortunately, it is not an issue of firearms. It's not an issue specifically of mental health. It's back to being a societal issue, a much larger scale thing that needs to be looked at from a basis of values and what we want to support. And really, it's all of us. I mean, everyone's a factor in that. So if at least you can out there, folks, if we can't get trained to identify this, um, at least be kind, use empathy, give someone a good word, and who knows, maybe you just incidentally, if not accidentally, change somebody's life. I know personally, I go out of my way, especially with young kids and teenagers in particular, to do that. I always want to say something good to them because I was kind of a weird kid on my own right, and I remember the few times that someone did say something good to me and how positive an effect that was. And these are memories I have, 30 years later. So
And you know,
at minimum, we can do that, right? At minimum.
well, a minimum, and sometimes we have to remind ourselves. I know we're past our time now, but we have to remind ourselves that it doesn't have to be actively saying something, right? Sometimes what I do when I see a kid sitting on the floor in the unit in a corner, I go and sit next to the kid, not too close, and you sit there because there's a presence, right? And it's interesting because they start feeling uncomfortable by you not talking,
Mm.
but that opens a door, right? So if you see a kid sitting in a park by himself or herself, you know, with an angry face, you can sit next to them, right? Um, and just be there. We see the problem is we don't make ourselves available.
Mm.
So more than what we say is the availability that we have to listen to them without judging. Okay. And that's not an easy thing to do, especially with the kids I see, because they've done a lot of bad things. Not that shouldn't be done at their age.
Mm.
But that's a reality. And it's not my job to say you're a bad kid or a good kid, right? It's not acceptable behavior and we need to find a way to modify it. But I'm not going to modify it by doing more criticism or more judging, right?
Do you think that's part of the problem with people trying to identify it was that we judge their actions instead of looking at the reality of why those actions are occurring and maybe the risk factors?
Well,
Instead, we're just angry they spilt the milk instead of why do they keep spilling the milk or what's
well,
pushing them to spill the milk?
you see, I always tell my students, I don't want the photograph. I want the
The
movie.
movie.
The photograph just tells me they're bad. I want the movie. How did they get from point A to point B? What is this history? And I want to visualize it so I can understand it, so I'm able to give something back that is positive for them.
So in a sad way, again, we are what creates mass shooters if we don't do the right things. I mean, really, society, our behaviors, the way we have potentially allow for neglect. But like anything in with the human mind and human behavior, it is changeable as long as we become aware of it first. I think maybe that's probably the one benefit of any of these incidents occurring is that we can now become a little bit more aware. If we become more aware, we can tune on those things and hopefully help out before these things occur. Doctor, once again, as always, thank you very much for your time and your wisdom.
Thank you. We'll see you next week. Take care, man.